So hello, everybody. Welcome to this presentation on the Child Who Acts Bossy. My name is Korah. I am the coordinator of the Center of Excellence for Behavior Management. And this is the fourth, I think, of the series. I did one on aggression. I did one on counter will, on the opposition resistance. I did one on anxiety. And now today we're doing the one on the student who is bossy. So I will share screen, and without further wait, let's move to this presentation. Alrighty, and so you will notice that the format of this presentation is the same format as the other ones. I was thinking that it was important to set the stage first before we can move over to more of the practical portions of it. So for those that may not be aware, for those who may have a copy of the Reclaiming Our Students, there is a chapter that is dedicated to that theme in their book called The Child Who Acts Bossy. I invite you to go and take a look at that chapter. There's also some editorials that exist. On our Center of Excellence for Behavior Management website, there's a whole page dedicated to students that are bossy and have demanding behavior. And you'll also find this other recording that myself and Maxine did, I believe, 2 years ago now. And so this is another one that's similar to some extent to this one. I'm kind of taking it one step further. And so I invite you to go and take a look at that page. We've got more resources there. And so it's important, in order to set the stage, to not start by the what should we do with students that are bossy, but look at why are they bossy in the first place. Let's make a sense of that. Let's unpack that first. And so the key insight here is that children's behavior isn't always what it seems. We need to dig deeper and look at what is happening beneath. And so using the analogy of the iceberg and thinking about the behavior, where you would see a whole slew of different types of behavior with a student who is bossy, whether it's the child who tries to dictate or to impose themselves, to ignore rules, to try to orchestrate a situation, to not respond well to authority, and so forth. So what is at the foundation of that, all of these behaviors that we see? And the analogy here is using the lens, so using the glasses as the lens. And so if we have better perspective and insight on what's at the root of these behaviors, not only is it going to help us inform ourselves on how to better address it, but also to be careful to not move into different strategies and interventions that might make things worse. And so the instinct that we're going to look at today is the alpha instinct. And this is what is at the root of the bossy behavior. And so here are some other examples of what a bossy student or child might look like. And so a student that wants to be first all the time, wants to be the best, to be on top, looking to take over or take charge of a situation, to be in the lead. Usually these are students that talk loudly, that talk over people, interrupt also, that talk for others, that command attention, or that tries to take center stage, that demands a deference. Deference, that means that they demand to stay in the lead. And so if there's another individual that tries to take the lead, they're trying to impose themselves to be able to keep that lead, to give orders, to take the command of a situation, to give directions, to provide meaning, to trump interaction, to have the last word, to be in the know, to have the most knowledge, to displace or resist being displaced, whether it's physical, emotional, or psychological, excuse me. And so let's understand more this alpha instinct. What are we talking about when we're talking about where does this come from? What is this about, and what's its purpose? And so please understand that the alpha instinct is born out of the attachment dynamic. And so understanding that in any attachment dynamic, so I'm just going to open all the little characters there. And so in the attachment dynamic, nobody attaches to equal, even between adults. There is always one person who is taken care of and the other who's being taken care of. And between adults, we switch. And so sometimes when we're talking to a friend and they ask us how we're doing, and then we start kind of, sharing with them how we're doing. So the person who's asking how they're doing is taking charge, and the fact that we're fitting into there, so you have that rapport. And of course that can switch. Ideally with a child, and even with an adolescent, the dynamic is meant to be that the adult is in charge and that the child is dependent onto the adult. And so the alpha instinct is the instinct to provide, to take care of, to be in charge of. And so it's necessary for all of us to have this instinct, because if we didn't have this instinct, then we would not move into the position of taking care of others, being responsible for others, and taking charge and so forth. And so there's a necessity to this instinct in order to create this dynamic, this attachment dynamic. So as I mentioned, the attachments are done hierarchically to facilitate the dependency and the caretaking, because if two people were going head to head, who would be taking care of whom? And the same idea, if you have two people that are wanting to be taken care of, then who's going to take care of the other person? And so the ideal is that there's one person in charge and the other one who's into the dependent position. When becoming attached or pursuing proximity, one is instinctively moved to assume the alpha position or the dependent position. So this is not something that we think of or that we choose or that we decide. This is something that happens spontaneously, naturally, instinctively. This happens in our bodies. And so the posture of one should typically call forth the complementary set in the attachment instinct of the other. So if there's one person who says, are you okay? And so they're coming in trying to take care of, and the other person says, oh no, I've had a really bad day. So you could see how that comes in together side by side. Now, please understand that ideally in our society, the alpha and the dependent would be in natural hierarchy. So for example, a parent and a child, a teacher and a student, a doctor and their patient, a coach and a player, an older sibling to a younger sibling. And so ideally in our society, these roles would match like this. However, when you have a young, immature child, especially a child who has a lot of defenses and where their alpha instinct has been perverted, now it's no longer about the role. So I'm not going to listen to you just because you're my parent, or just because you're my teacher, or just because you're my principal or coach or whatever that is. It's not about the role for those students. It is about, it's a feeling of being safe, and that the other person seems to be in charge and taking care of us. And so it's easier for us to relax and to be able to slide into that dependent position when we feel that strong presence from the other. And so please understand that, you know, decades and decades ago, society had a big role in trying to put pressure or put parameters, should I say, structure around the importance of roles, and that, you know, everybody had respect for the teacher in the society. Everybody had respect for certain roles, for the police officer, for example. And these things have kind of shifted in our society and has been lost to some extent. And so at this point, the role itself is no longer sufficient. Yes, so let's continue. And so I mentioned that the alpha instinct is threefold. There's three kind of elements that play into this alpha instinct. The first one, yes, is to take charge, because you cannot take care of somebody if you're not in charge of the situation. And being in charge means that you're in the lead, that you're in the know, and so forth. And so that's the first part in terms of the alpha instinct. However, if the person is a what's the word, that their heart is soft, that they're a nurturing alpha person, then it's not just a question of taking charge and being bossy. The other two parts that come together hand in hand is to be able to assume responsibility for those that you're taking care of. And the third piece is caring for them and caring about them. And so these three are supposed to come hand in hand together. So when you have a healthy alpha dynamic, now the adult is there to provide the support, but the child is seeking for the adult to take care of them. And so this is where we have a healthy dynamic between a child, and please hear me, I'm saying child, but adolescent is equally true in this example. And so both parties are fulfilled in this dance, because the adult is able to fulfill their role as the provider, and the child is feeling taken care of, feeling safe, and so their role of the seeker, of the dependent, is being fulfilled as well. However, where this can become perverted is that some children, for many different reasons, whether it's because of overwhelming sensitivities, where they've had trauma in their past, or they had a prenatal stress or birth traumas, or just the sensitivity in their genes, or that there has been a wounding environment where they've been impacted in many different ways, whether there was neglect or abuse and so forth. All of the defenses now are starting to harden the vulnerability in the heart. And so the first elements that disappear when the defenses come up is the feeling of caring. And so there's no longer compassion, enthusiasm, devotion, concern, investment in, and so forth. And so this is kind of numbed out, because in order to feel all your feelings, you need to not have these walls up and to protect yourself. And so the moment that the walls are up to protect the brain, and for the brain to feel safe, then certain emotions dissipate, like feeling of caring and feeling of responsibility as well, because in order to be responsible for somebody, what goes hand in hand with being responsible is also feeling guilty if things are not being done right, or feeling remorse, or trying to make things better, and so forth. And these are very vulnerable feelings to feel that you're not up to the challenge. And so what happens in this dynamic, to go back to this example here with the 3 keys, is that if there's no assuming to responsibility and that there's no move to care, then what's left and the instinct is only the motion to dominate. And so when the defenses come up, the different portions that play a role here, I just kind of want to, I'll just open all of this up so you can see it all. It really is a continuum. And so the alpha instinct, the more that it gets blocked, the further it goes down the continuum. And so at the first hand of the continuum, at the least level of defense, you may have a student who is having issues with compliance. Now, not last month, but 2 months ago, I presented on the student who is resistant and oppositional. And so the 2 instincts work together hand in hand. And so please keep this in mind. The reason why we're talking about compliance here is because if the student in their instinct believe that they're the ones who should be in charge, then it doesn't feel right for them to follow the lead of somebody else, because technically in their not just their mind, but their bodies, they feel that they're the ones who should be in charge. And so at the most kind of higher level of defense would be the compliance, the problem with compliance. If you continue on the continuum, the next level of defense would be a student that now is becoming very demanding, where they're trying to orchestrate how the adults will take care of them. And so they're bossy, not about trying to control others, but they're bossy about how others need to take care of them, how they're going to do it, in which way. Like I could think about children when they're in the car with their parents and they tell their parents to hold on to the steering wheel with both hands. Can you please make sure you've got your signal on? Make sure you've got the seatbelt on. Those are the demanding students or children that become very bossy, and how adults are supposed to take care of them and lead the world. I can't get into the details of all of it, but eating problems is another element that is much too, I couldn't have time right now to explain it. But eating problems, there's a portion that plays into this that comes from the alpha instinct, because food is actually a caretaking element. And so if a child doesn't feel that the adult is there to take care of them, then it doesn't feel right to be fed by that adult. And so there's a piece there in terms of eating problems. Bossiness in terms of telling people what to do and trying to control people, this is the next level. And then if we continue on, you've got the obsession with winning, the obsession with dominance, the narcissism, and the last portion, which I will spend very little time, but I will kind of broach over it at the end, is the bullying phenomenon. And so the bullying phenomenon is really the other extension of all of the defenses. So we go from a student who's non-compliant to a student who would be a textbook bully, and looking at that and to be able to make sense of it. But before I get there, I kind of want to walk through the other levels of defenses. And so, of course, if you have a student that is resistant or that is being demanding, then both parties don't have a very fulfilling dynamic. It is a dynamic that becomes very confusing, highly frustrating for both, and exhausting, because the adult is trying to provide, and yet the child won't make space for the adult to provide, because for different reasons, they're not feeling that it's either safe to depend on them, or it doesn't feel right, or it doesn't feel natural for the adult to take the lead when it's them who should be in the lead. And so you could see how the dynamic at this level becomes, highly frustrating and exhausting for both parties. And so, of course, alpha children are very challenging given that reason. They're much less receptive to being led in general. They're highly resistant to the direction and the guidance of adults. They're often less endearing to the adults, tending to alienate them and so forth in their behavior. They appear to look independent and not needy, but please understand that these are defenses. They're not truly independent and truly not needy. They are kind of numbing that down and bringing this need to be taken care of. They're kind of pushing it down because it feels too vulnerable in order to allow yourself to feel those things. And so from the outside, it may look like students that are very independent and not needy, and yet it's not the truth. They're very difficult to satiate and to bring to rest, because if they don't feel taken care of, there's no opportunity for them to feel fulfilled and to be able to be at rest. And these are students with whom trying to put in place consequences and sanctions for their behavior can become highly provocative, because they, like I mentioned, they don't feel that it's right for the other adults to be in charge. And so when the adults come in and are upping the ante, this just becomes more provocative for them. Now, the second key insight here is that some children's behavior, well, actually, all children's behavior is based on development and emotional maturity. And so we cannot push and pull to get what is expected. And so understanding that the alpha instinct has a purpose, it is there in the service of attachment. This is what helps the caretaking dynamic. And it's quite healthy. I just realized I didn't put the right word here. It should have been alpha. It's quite healthy for the child to show some alpha tendencies to some extent, because the alpha instincts in the healthy kind of non-defended way about not just taking care of, but also assuming responsibility and to care for, these are things that we're all born with. And this is something that even when a young child, to be able to take care of a younger sibling, to be able to take care of a plant or a pet, this instinct to take care of is something that is innate, that we have as of birth. And so the tendency itself is natural and normal. The issue is not the instinct. The issue is when the instinct becomes perverted because of the defenses. And so if we continue here, why are children moved by their alpha instincts? And so there is a natural and intended purpose to the alpha instincts. We're all born with this potential. It is quite healthy for a child to show alpha tendencies, as I was mentioning. But when a child stays stuck in that alpha mode, they may be having difficulties with experiencing vulnerability, vulnerable feelings, having a hard time feeling safe in the dependent position, and having a hard time trusting the adults. And so if a relationship is well attached, then by the instinct of attachment, the child will want to listen to us, to attend to what we have to say, to want to follow us, to want to please us, to measure up to us, to look up to us, to trust us, and so forth. And so this would be the natural instinct of attachment. But if that instinct of attachment becomes perverted, and now the child is no longer attaching in the dependent position, but trying to take the lead, now this becomes a whole different dynamic. And so one of the things that we need to be really careful of, going back to this point about not pushing and pulling to get what we want and what's expected, is that sometimes without realizing, the adults will put in place certain conventional practices in order to contain the behavior or to get the behavior desired. Whether it's through rewards and consequences, whether it's through behavior management systems, whether it's sending the student to the principal's office, whether it's through detention and reflection rooms, student behavior contracts, zero tolerance discipline measures and suspensions and so forth. The problem with these approaches with a child who's highly defended is that not only does this make it more provocative for them because they're the ones who should be in charge, it actually can exacerbate the problem and make that the child will trust the adults even less. And so we need to understand that trying to control these students that are trying to take charge is actually an impossible task to some extent, because it's a myth for us to believe that we can actually truly control a child. It is actually through our relationship and having a good attachment that in their instinct to attach to us, will they follow us and take her cues and so forth. And so it's not that the adult is trying to control the child, it's that the attachment is allowing for the child to want to take her cues. And so if you're going at it in an artificial way, then you're going against nature. And this just causes more frustration in the child. It could trigger them even further because they feel coerced in the situation. This could increase pushback from the child. And then, of course, this becomes a dance of back and forth, where if the child ups the ante, now the adult ups the ante and so forth. And of course, this becomes highly frustrating for both parties. But at the same time, when the adult is going head to head with the child and going through power struggles, the issue there is not only is the child not buying in, but the other kids who are witnessing this are realizing after minutes and minutes of time of going back and forth and power struggles, that the adult is kind of showing their hand that they're not really in control of that situation. And so other kids could lose trust in that adult as well. And so the danger here, just to use kind of like this imagery, is that if the child from their defendedness and their blocked instinct will make that they'll have alienating behavior, and that then in turn the adult will be upset by that and use more conventional discipline, all this will do is create more defendedness, and this will become a vicious circle. The third key insight is that some children are more at risk towards developing emotional and behavioral problems. And so, for example, a child who's hypersensitive, and so we're thinking about the continuum of, for example, a child who's on the autism spectrum, or a child who's gifted, who has hypersensitivities and has intense emotions, a child who has some sort of sensory issue. For those kids who live the world through their body very intensely and becomes very overwhelming, these are children for whom life feels out of control. And so oftentimes for our sensitive kids, in order to compensate for this world that is out of control, will try through their alpha instinct to take control in order to balance out this sense of unsafety for them. And so we can, if you think about some students that you work with, you may notice that a lot of these kids that tend to be more bossy are also kids that are very bright, very perceptive, very sensitive, could have sensory issues and so forth. The two really play hand in hand. The other piece that I should mention is that the alpha instinct that becomes perverted, because the alpha instinct in itself is normal, we all have that instinct. But for it to become perverted, two possibilities and the combination of the two can arise. And so in the first example, which is the alpha by default, this happens when the adults do not assume their alpha posture or convey an alpha presence. And so this could be a student for whom their parents have their own issues and are kind of caught up in their own problems and so forth. Talking about and weak or inadequate parenting, talking about a parent who looks to the child to fill their own needs, where there's parenting on demand, where there's some neglect to some extent, and they're only filling in their role when there's incidences and big problems that happen, where there's a dynamic where there's a child-led parenting, or that parents are looking for the answers rather than being the answer to the child. And so these are the parents that ask a lot of questions, that ask questions even to their kids about how they should be doing this or that. And so we call this the alpha by default. Now, please understand, right now I'm saying parents, but I've seen situations where children have had very healthy, stable family lives, loving parents, very intentional, very present, and yet they still find themselves in situations where their alpha instinct has been perverted. And so these are the other kids in this other column here that is alpha by defense. And so the alpha by defense happens when it doesn't feel safe to depend. And so it doesn't mean that the adults are not present and not trying to take the lead, is that for the child, for different reasons, it doesn't feel safe to do so, where they don't feel taken care of, where they could have been bullied by not necessarily a parent, it could be by a sibling or by a family member, where there's been some abuse or some exploitation. And remember, it's not necessarily within the direct family, this could be on the outside too, where parenting practices were put in place to exploit the child's dependency and so forth, like using threats or using ultimatums and so forth, and experiencing alarming situations or circumstances. And so to go back to the kids who are hypersensitive, for those kids, the world feels overwhelming. And so when the world feels overwhelming, then it's really difficult for them to manage. The other piece to think about as well that plays into this is the attachment serving them or is it harming them? And so Gordon Neufeld, who's the founder of the Neufeld Institute, he's the one who's created the theory around attachment and how attachment unfolds, and speaks about the 6 different ways that children attach. And so if there's a healthy, stable, safe type of attachment, then children will attach one after the other and will deepen further and further their attachment. However, if they feel that they are left out or feel that they are different, or feel that they don't belong, or feel that they don't matter, that they're not loved, or that they're not understood or known. And remember, it's not that this is the reality in their environment. It could be the fear of, the anticipation of. And so this could create alarm in children about their attachments, and this plays into triggering the defenses around the attachment and could perverse the dynamic where the child doesn't feel safe to be in the dependent position because none of this feels safe. And so rather than being in this position, we'll take the lead and we'll be in charge instead. And so for those kids, if we look at the continuum of the sequencing of things, is that from the sensitivities that are overwhelmed, that will create the defendedness in their system, this will play into the missing feelings. Remember, we talked about the sense of responsibility and the sense of caring. And so if they're stuck developmentally because they don't have all the feelings necessary to grow up, then this brings forward problems in terms of learning and behavior. And so what we're going to look at is how can we undo this? How can we help children that are feeling overwhelmed or that are feeling that their life is out of control, that are not feeling safe and not feeling taken care of? How can we help them come back to a place where they can trust and depend on the adult? And then at that point, they'll be able to soften their defenses and the alpha instinct will come back to what it needs to be. And so the next piece that I want to look at is how do we go about doing this on the wide scale, in a school and supporting these students that are very bossy. And so what's really important to look at is that the school team has a common and shared vision, that they have insight and practices that are based in insight about the alpha dynamic, that the practices are adult-centered. So it's not about making the child responsible for their own behavior, because they're already defended to a sense of responsibility anyway. And so it's about what can the adults do to scaffold and to compensate and to soften the child in order to help kind of bring down these defenses. And of course, because these students are so highly challenging, how can we work as a team to be able to share the weight for it to not be all on the shoulders of one adult, but that it's really shared from the classroom to the hallway to outside and in the building and so forth. And so the model that I've been talking about in every single of my presentations is the RTI model, where we're working in parallel, putting in place best practices for all, but then also targeted practices for some students that are somewhat defended and have some alpha tendencies, and having individualized plans for those few students that are highly alpha blocked and that have these very bossy type of tendencies. And so the analogy here, if you think about the gardener who understands intuitively that when the flower doesn't grow, it's not about tugging at the flower to make it grow, it's about working on the environment. And so it's the same thing with the student who's alpha. It's not about trying to fix the child, it's about trying to set up the environment to help soften the child and then to be able to help move forward. So the shift here, if we go back to the analogy of the lens, excuse me, I'm just going to go back here just to go back to that slide. So the lens and trying to shift our lens to looking at it from another angle. And so rather than focusing on the student's behavior and thinking, so what's wrong with this student and how can we get this behavior to stop, that we shift our lens to, oh my goodness, I could see how this student is experiencing way too much separation or feeling unsafe or feeling not taken care of. What can I do as a caring, supportive adult to help this student feeling safe and taken care of, to help minimize the impact of the separation in their system? And this in turn will help in terms of the behavior. And so in order for behavior to change, ultimately here is what needs to happen. There needs to be a good working attachment where the child can feel safe and taken care of. And then to be able to soften their defenses and feel some vulnerability, which will allow for them to feel their emotions that they need to feel, This will allow for the child to mature, and it's the maturation that will make that their behavior then will change and will become a more mature type of behavior. So now that we've looked at the why and the how, now let's look at, so what are our more concrete practices that we can put in place in order to help these students be more successful? You'll notice if you go and visit our website, so you've got here the address. By the way, I will be emailing you the handout. So please, don't feel that you need to take tons of notes. You will have access to these slides. We've got on our website, so cbmmember.ca, under bossiness and demanding behavior, I mentioned that you will find a recording and there's resources and stuff. On that page, we've got a placemat that speaks specifically about students that are bossy and demanding, and what this behavior looks like in the classroom, what it looks like in the playground, and how can we scaffold and support that student in the classroom, on the playground. Why is it that some of these students have gotten to this place? What should we be careful not to put in place in order to exacerbate the situation and make it worse? And down here, we've got for the tier 2 and 3 students, what can we do beyond the tier 1 best practices to help support these students? And so I invite you to go and download this handout, this placemat. I will be emailing it to you along with the handout as well, so you'll get a copy of it too. So what I want to do with you today is walk through from tier 1 to tier 2 to tier 3, what are things that we could put in place to help support these students. So please remember that tier 1, we're talking about universal practices for all. They're meant to be for the whole group. These are usually led by the classroom teacher, or if there's other adults that are there to help the teacher, they're meant to be preventative. And the idea here is to focus on adult warm and strong leadership, and to be able to offer a variety of different measures in order to help students with different needs. So if we go back to this continuum that I had, so we're going to focus right now on students that have compliance issues. So in the classroom, what this could look like, for example, is that you may have a student that may react to a very simple request, where we ask the students to put away their pencil, or to take out a book, or that we ask them to stand in line, or we ask them to get ready to go to this next specialist, and so forth. And so where the student would have a reaction to these very simple requests, getting dressed and ready to go outside and so forth. We may see where the student may refuse to complete work, or may start to attempt to it, but then when feeling too much pressure may stop and refuse completely to continue. On the playground, an example of this type of behavior would be a student, for example, who ignores the rules when they're trying to play a game, because for them, it's not that they're taking they're not taking others' rules, they're the ones who are making the rules. And so the alpha instinct can trigger what we call the counter will. So counter will is the resistant and oppositional instinct, because it doesn't feel right to follow someone else's lead. And so at tier 1, what's really, really important is to be able to establish safety in the classroom and to be able to establish the rapport with students. And what I mean by that is not just that in the morning we say hello to everybody, that we greet them and so forth, and that we have a nice smile. It really needs to be something that is much more systematic. And so it may be that every morning, each child you may, or at least the ones that you've selected that really need this extra type of support, that you intentionally seek to connect with those specific students in the morning to make sure that they've connected back to you. So it's not just that you've connected to them, they need to connect back to you. Knowing their name, having these little tidbits that you know about them to show that you are engaged into that dynamic and to help them feel safe, and so forth. And so being able to take that lead. Part of taking that lead, oh, and by the way, excuse me, I forgot to mention, these are 2 editorials that are available on Hannah Beach's website. And so you've got the link here to go and read them. I invite you to go and take a look. And she kind of brings it one step further. And so what's needed here is the strong, warm alpha leadership. And so yes, it is about setting limits and about setting boundaries, but it's done in a way where it's very warm still and playful. And so it's that dance between having the consistency and having the boundaries and the limits, but at the same time not coming down very harsh, where we're able to kind of bring humor out and so forth, and to be able to help kind of from underneath find strategies to get the kids to come along. And so having the dance of the two is ideal. Being careful with decision making, that we're not asking the student's opinion at every step that we're moving through, let's say a lesson of some sort or an activity of some sort. It's important that the adult stays in the lead of this. And sometimes, adults are well-meaning when they're asking students where they're at or asking their opinions. We need to be really careful that there's not too much of that also. And so meeting the needs of the students rather than their demands, and understanding the difference between needs and demands. Having an I've got this type of attitude. And this doesn't mean that we know what we're doing all the time, every time. Obviously, situations happen, on a regular basis where adults scratch their heads and like, oh my goodness, what am I going to do with this situation? And so it's not about having the answers. It's about making it seem like as if you've got this. And so it's all in the appearance. It's all about in the posture, in the, the way that we're talking to the students and so forth. This is what makes the difference. Being careful with displaying our own fears and insecurities. And so trying to keep that hidden, that children don't need to know these things from the adults. If we have complaints to make about classroom management or about certain students that have highly challenging behaviors, this is an adult matter. This needs to be discussed among adults away from students, not in the presence of students. Being cautious with reacting intensely to the child's behavior, or sometimes it's unintentional, but having an approach that may be shaming. Focusing on taking charge of the situation rather than trying to control the child. So an example of this could be that, what could be an example? Your students want to do an activity, I'll start over. You want to have students do a writing activity. And then as you start the writing activity, you notice that you're getting a lot of resistance from different students, and some of them don't want to do the activity. Some of them are flat out refusing to do it, crossing their arms and just not taking the pencil and not doing it. And so sometimes rather than trying to push the activity and saying, we got to do this, I'm not stopping until you guys finish it. Sometimes it can be about, okay, class, I'm noticing that right now, there needs to be a refocus. How about we do, I don't know, it could be a brain break activity or something like that to get the focus off of the task. And then after you've helped the students walk that through to be able to, get out some of that energy or whatnot, then you could go back to the activity. But to try to force and to give consequences because children are not or resisting and so forth, this will just up the ante. And so sometimes it's about trying to move away from that situation and trying to do something else, and then you can come back. Or it could be if it's one particular student who's resisting, that maybe you have a private conversation with that student outside of the class, where you could say to that student, well, how about if you start with 2 lines? I know you can do 2 lines, I believe in you. And then after you finish the 2 lines, then I'll get for you an activity that you can do that you really like. And then we can finish the whole thing tomorrow or something like that. And so it's not about negotiating. It's about saying to the child, I've understood that the resistance is coming because there's a reason behind that. I'm hearing you, I'm empathetic to you. I still want some of it to be done, but I'm willing to put other things in place in order to make it work for everybody. And so this is the difference between taking charge of a situation versus trying to take control of the child's behavior. And so one of the things, and teachers do this all the time. And so I'm not, inventing anything new, but how important it is to have in place structures and routines to orchestrate the behavior. Many teachers have visuals in the classroom about what's the schedule of the day and what's coming up next, or about certain rules that we have in class, about the volume of the voice, or about keeping our hands to ourselves. And so when you use these structures and routines and visuals, and that you teach them in a fun way, then it's not about Mrs. So-and-so has said, this is what the classroom does. And so it becomes something that is much less coercive for the child, because it's not about Mrs. So-and-so, it's about this is what's happening for everybody. Another example, so I mentioned this already, but about addressing the student privately, being careful that the power struggle doesn't happen in public, backing off until you can have a better hold on the child. I've seen, very experienced teachers that will give a directive to a student, but then won't wait that the student starts the task, will walk away to go address another student and give them space in order to save face, and then to go back to do it on their own, to make the decision on their own. Sometimes when we're in their face or we're too much in their private space, that it creates more coercion and pressure, and this will not help in terms of the power struggle. And drawing attention away from the coercive elements. And so that was the example about doing a brain break and then coming back to the activity and to be able to move away from that. Now, in terms of taking charge of the situation, rather than trying to control the child, sometimes we're stuck in a situation where the adult needs to change their mind, because if not, it's just going to continue being a head-to-head. And so the analogy here, kind of like the car that's skidding on ice. And so when you're skidding on ice, you've got your steering wheel and you're trying as best as you can to maneuver the car to not spin out, but that you're still kind of skidding and you're sliding. And so this is the analogy of handling children that are very resistant and oppositional. And so using things like, yes, I understand what you're saying. How about if we ... And so how about if we do this later? Or how about I'll find a time for us to do this? And so it's the same thing if we change our mind. It could be that you say to the group, you know what, now that I'm noticing that the group probably needs some space to move, I've decided that we're going to leave this task aside for now, and now we're going to do a brain break and we'll come back to the task. And so it's not the kids who decided, it's the adult who decided, given that there was an analysis of the environment and the kids were not ready to do it, that you have decided, now that you've picked up on these observations, that it will do something else and we'll come back. And so this makes it look like you're still in charge of that situation. Now, I talked about speaking to a student privately and to give them space. The other thing that we could do with a student who's being highly resistant is that we give them the chance to go and take a break in the classroom. And so some classrooms, and I've seen this as I visited, have quiet corners where the student can go and cocoon. And this is not meant to be, this is not a reward. It's not because the student's well-behaving. This is meant to be a respite for the child because things are not working. It's an intervention tool. And so students are meant to go there to recenter themselves and because they're so heightened in that moment of the power struggle, you just want the energy to come down. And so the student could go in this corner in order to recenter themselves before we come back to re-engage them. The other idea could be that rather than doing it in the classroom, we send the student out of the class, but not because they're punished and they're going to the reflection room. We're sending them out to see another adult to help distract from the situation at hand and to help the child recenter themselves. And so the Center of Excellence have created these sheets that are You've Got Mail, and in them there's activities that the students can do. And so again, they're not meant to be a reward, they're meant to be a tool, and they're there for the benefit of helping a student recenter themselves and calm down, so they will be available again to take our directives. And so this needs to be set up ahead of time, where there's another adult in the building that knows that they'll be receiving the student and that know how to use the sheet. And then the student is sent there to do either a quiet activity or to do a movement break. And then they come back. So it's not something where they go for an hour, they go for 10 minutes. It's just a question of them, getting out of the class, doing their activity and coming back. Now, in terms of tier 2, now we're focusing more on targeted practices. These are meant for your some of the challenging students. And so it's not for the whole class. It's not for the few that are highly challenging. It's for the some that are somewhat challenging. And so these are oftentimes still led by the teacher, but then there could also be the support staff that helps with the teacher outside of the room if it can't be managed in the classroom. And of course, these students also benefit from the tier 1 measures. So we put the tier 1 in place and we add on the tier 2. So examples of the behavior would be the highly demanding child. So I kind of just wanted to give you an example of what a healthy providing alpha looks like in their instinct compared to a demanding perverted alpha in their instinct. So a providing alpha has it in them to want to take care of others. In contrast, a demanding alpha demands to be taken care of. The providing alpha fulfills others' needs. The demanding alpha demands that his own needs are being fulfilled. The providing alpha protects the vulnerable, so protects others and their vulnerability. The demanding child avoids being vulnerable themselves. Oops, sorry, I went too fast. The providing alpha assumes responsibility, whereas the demanding alpha holds others responsible when things are not working. The providing alpha provides safety and pushes away fear, whereas the demanding alpha demands safety from others and hides his own fears. The providing alpha needs deference to be effective, so he needs to stay on top, whereas the demanding alpha demands, so it's not that he needs to, he will impose on to stay on top. The providing alpha celebrates others' success, whereas the demanding alpha resents that others are successful, that wants to focus only on their fulfillment and success. The providing alpha avoids exposing and shaming others, whereas the demanding alpha demands to not be shamed or exposed. And the providing alpha conveys belonging, whereas the demanding alpha tries to possess and own others. So you could see how the instincts are similar, but you can see the twisting of the instinct there, where it doesn't become about myself taking care of others, but it becomes about this demand that others take care of me. And so this is the demanding alpha. And so I'm sure some of you can think of some of your students that are like this. And so examples of this in the classroom is the student who's demanding that we bring them the pencil, or that they don't have the book, they're demanding to get a copy of the book, the activity that they're working with. That might hold others responsible when the activity at hand is not working, and so forth. Outside in the schoolyard, it might be that they demand that they're included in the game, that they blame others if the game's not working well and that they're losing. And so these are examples of the child who is demanding. Deborah McNamara wrote an article called Why Kids Don't Need Attention, but an Invitation for Relationship. You've got the link here to the article. I invite you to go and take a look at that article. I wanted to read this one paragraph here. We cannot release our children from their hunger for relationship by simply responding to their calls for our attention. We need to seize the lead in providing for them to give more than is being pursued, and to take responsibility for fulfilling their hunger for connection. If they have to work to get our attention, then they cannot rest in it and can become enslaved to the performance of required to getting that attention. And so I really want to shift from saying this student needs attention to this student is seeking for connection, needing to feel taken care of. This is something much more deep and complex than just needing to have attention. So I invite you to go and take a look at that article. But one thing that I do wanted to say in the more concrete, and so to go back to the 6 levels of attachment, I've put here together a graph where you've got the description of every single level of attachment and what adults can do in good times and in not so good times in order to help the student feel taken care of at each level of attachment. And so I'm not saying that you should be doing all of these with all of your students at all times. What I'm saying is that with those selected students, especially those that are very demanding, trying to figure out where they're connecting, and oftentimes it's probably the first 2 that are the most relevant, to be able to demonstrate, not just when things are going well, but especially when things are not going well, how we're still there for them, and that we're still there to want to take care of them, and they're still our student no matter what. And this makes all the difference. So I invite you to go and take a look at that graph when you'll receive the handout. The other thing that I would suggest for those very demanding students, to be able to, not just for the teacher to have all the weight, but to be able to share the weight among different adults, is that the student is assigned. So this is not something that is being done randomly or spontaneously. This is something that is done systematically. So we have a list of all those students that are highly demanding, and we matchmake them with adults with whom they have a good relationship with. And depending on how challenging these students are, they may meet with that significant adult a few times a week, to every day, to a few times a day. And so they're meant to go and connect with that adult to kind of check in and see where they're at. Did they let's say first thing in the morning, did they sleep last night? Did they have breakfast? Do they have the materials they need to come to class? Are they ready to learn and to be able to connect with them? What do they need if ever things aren't going well, and so forth? And so when you're setting up this rapport, not just with the classroom teacher, but also with this other significant adult in the building, what we're hoping for is that we could get ahead of the need that child has, and to be able to satiate them and to fulfill them, to bring them to rest. And so this could be another idea for the challenging student. Now, for the highly challenging student, and this oftentimes is as much out of class than it is in class, these are students that benefit from individualized practices. These are the students for whom we would be putting together intervention plans. Every child in Tier 3 should have an intervention plan. And we should continue to put in place Tier 1 and Tier 2 interventions, additional to those we're putting to Tier 3. So now we're talking about the bossy. If we go back to this slide here, so now we're moving on to the continuum, we're talking about the bossy student. And so what this may look like in class is that student who's very loud, or that tries to impose themselves onto other, or that doesn't willingly respond to authority, especially with substitute teachers. This is such a hard thing with substitute teachers. These are the kids in the schoolyard that try to control who will speak to whom, who's friends with whom, who hangs out with whom, and that dictates when and how and how the game will be played. And so they try to boss everybody around. These are the kids for whom if you remember that pyramid that I showed you about the learning and behavior problems, if we're able to put a good relational support in place, this in turn will help to soften their defenses, help them feel their emotions, develop more healthily, and this will help answer the behavior and the learning problems. And so these are the kids for whom we need to be careful that the alpha instinct, their alienating behavior, does not break the connection with us. We cannot take it personal. It isn't personal. They're not doing this on purpose to piss us off or to hurt us. It is just something that is instinctual to them, and that it doesn't feel right or safe for them. We need to anticipate and expect these behaviors, because if we are caught off guard, we're going to react very differently than if we expect them. And so if we know they're going to come, the way that we're going to compensate for them will be very different, in order to reflect the instinct as natural and normal. It's okay. We all have these moments where we're bossy and so forth. And so for them not to feel ashamed, for them not to feel guilty or feeling terrible about that, embarrassed and so forth, we want to be careful about these very vulnerable feelings, because it may harden them further. Being careful with the type of discipline that we use, because it causes more separation. I talked already about that. That we don't make the behavior the bottom line. So even if the student has to be suspended because they've done something that is beyond, and that there needs to be some disciplinary measures in place, that we still follow up with that student when they're home the next day, that we check in and make sure they're okay, that when they come back, that we tell them that we're happy that they're back, that we want to work with them and so forth. It's important that we repair if things have, let's say there has been a power struggle, that we repair some of that relationship. That's not what I meant to do. You're still my student. Of course, I want you to come to class and that we work together. They need to hear this from us explicitly, because these are the kids, although they look like porcupines or have this armor on, these kids are so vulnerable and so insecure inside and need to be reassured very explicitly from us. And so examples where we can help kind of bring their bossy energy out in a healthy way could be, for example, that they're a teacher's helper, helping to pass out some papers, helping with the recycling, to opening the door, when students are coming in and out of the classroom, helping other students with academic tasks or being a reading buddy, taking care of class plants or class pets, taking charge of organizing the special activity on fun days, taking charge and organizing outdoor games for younger students. How can we place these bossy kids who it's in their instinct to boss, to try to help kind of channel this energy in more positive ways? And so this could be examples in where we can do this. Other ideas is through play. How can we, through games and through play, help, especially with younger kids, thinking of, where they can play the parrot or the policeman, or be the lion or be the king and queen, to be able to act out the need to be the boss, where they're playing sports game, where they're being competitive, and so forth. It might be through playful activities and so forth that we can help bring out this energy. How can we have other spaces in the building? Because these are highly challenging students and they're really hard to manage on a daily basis in the classroom. And so where else could they go besides the classroom? Could there be an oasis room, a nurturing support center, a tech space, a resource teacher space, even with the school secretary, where they can go and have moments of respite, where they can go and connect with another adult? Because ultimately for those students, managing the alpha instinct is about right relationship, and soft hearts. And so to be able to focus on that. Now, I don't have much time, but I wanted to talk about really quickly the bully dynamic. So this was the extreme there of this, the continuum. And so the bully dynamic is basically the alpha that's perverted with further defenses. And so if we continue onto the continuum, the more we move on this line, the more defenses are there. And so this is the ultimate defense that is there for the child who is a bully, has bully instinct and syndrome. And so the bully instinct results from the alpha instinct perverted by emotional defense. The bully instinct can be specific to certain situations or relationships, or can become a signature trait or personality. And so it could either be that there's moments, there's acts or tendencies of bullying, or it could be that it's completely taken over the individual who is acting like a bully. And so if we look at the comparison from the providing alpha to the demanding alpha, now the bully alpha is who's devoid of caring and responsibility, exploits the signs of caring instead of caring for others, exploits neediness instead of fulfilling others' needs, exploits vulnerability instead of protecting the vulnerable, holds victims responsible instead of assuming responsibility, attempts to alarm and to exploit fears rather than providing safety for them, punishes the lack of deference instead of looking for ways to be in charge to be effective, sabotages others' successes instead of celebrating them, exposes and shames others instead of avoiding to do that, and exploits the need to belong instead of conveying belonging. So you could see the continuum of the exact same instinct that is pushing itself further and further away from the sense of caring and responsibility. My colleague Eva de Goscinny did a whole 2-part series on the bully dynamic. I invite you to go and take a look at those 2 recordings. There's so much more there that I can even give it justice right now. But to conclude for today's session, what's the role of the adult vis-a-vis the alpha instinct, not taking it personally, recognizing that it's an instinct, that kids are not doing it on purpose, they're not choosing to do this, aiming for the adult to not do harm, allowing for the child to feel safe and to depend on us, to convey a strong alpha presence so they can trust us and feel confident with us, refraining from revealing our own needs and fears and inadequacies, making room to display some healthy leadership on their part, and to be able to indulge the alpha instinct in the play mode. So I invite you to go and take a look at our website for more resources. You've got the page here. You'll see that on the page, I've got 4 different editorials. So you have the link here directly on the handout, but they're also on our website on the alpha instinct. And as a final slide, please know that we've got 2 upcoming events. I've got one in March for the teen anxiety and resilience. And we've got a new one that's just been added recently. This was on, after popular request on the child who is autistic. And so to be able to handle the challenging behavior of a child who is ASD. And that one's going to be on April 20th. So I will stop sharing and I will stop the recording.